Hello everyone, and welcome to Videonet's live webcast entitled Winning with Immersive Video, One Screen at a Time, which is about how broadcasters and platform operators could create and possibly dominate the market for immersive video. My name's Barry Flynn. I'm contributing editor at Videonet, who are hosting this webcast, and I'm your moderator for the next hour. A little bit of explanation and housekeeping before I introduce the panel and kick off. Once logged into the webcast portal, you can see that you can ask questions. We encourage you to use this facility, but please do keep your questions short because it's easier for us to display and read them at this end. We'll store up your audience questions and direct them at our panelists at the end of each of the 4 sections of the webcast. We'd also like to invite you to participate in a live poll, which we're going to push at you about halfway through the webcast and which you'll see on your screens. To give you a bit of thinking time, the poll question is, do broadcasters and platform operators need to launch compelling 4K/UHD multi-screen offers such as VOD and catch-up? I'll repeat that. Do broadcasters and platform operators need to launch compelling 4K UHD multi-screen offers such as VOD and catch-up? And the possible answers are A, yes, and quickly ahead of broadcast deployments. Yes, but no hurry. They can coincide with or follow broadcast deployments. C, no. Broadcast services are what matter in the ultra-quality market. Anyway, we'll push those questions up on the screen halfway through this webcast. Once we do that, you'll have 3 or 4 minutes while we do a Q&A with our 2 guests, and then we'll push the results back up to you at the end of that Q&A session. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers to you. They are Spencer Stevens, Chief Technology Officer at Sony Pictures, who's been thinking about and working on the delivery of 4K ever since it was just something to do with digital cinema.
Hello.
Hi, Spencer. And Ian Trow, Senior Director of Emerging Technology and Strategy at Harmonic. He's currently focused on new codecs like HEVC and their use for delivering 4K and UHD, and he has over 22 years of systems and design experience in HD and MPEG video compression products. So, to recap what this panel is all about, we're going to be providing an update on broadcast UHD developments and considering the overall opportunity for platform operators and broadcasters to create a new market for television, roughly defined as immersive video. By that phrase, we mean a concept that's not just about more pixels, but goes beyond 4K to talk about better pixels, and which includes features like high dynamic range, wider color gamut, enhanced audio, and where appropriate, higher frame rates, all in order to draw the audience into live events and dramatic storytelling. The idea is that the traditional broadcast market is well placed to complement first screen viewing with second screen, multi-screen experiences of this kind, and has good competitive reasons for wanting to do so. On the way, we'll take a look, if there's time, at ideas around 360-degree TV, companion UHD experiences, and even virtual reality TV. So let's begin with the multi-screen 4K opportunity. Spencer, I'll ask you to take this one. Why is it that UHD 4K is generally appearing first on OTT platforms like Netflix?
I think there's really 2 reasons for that. The first reason is the fact that they tend to be closed systems. Netflix, for example, is streaming from Netflix servers to Netflix apps on TVs and other players. And I think that really makes it much easier for them to switch to a new format. And I think the other question is, why is it over the top? Is because, very simply, there's not any broadcast standards yet, at least only some emerging in Korea and Japan. But generally speaking, there aren't any solid standards for delivering it in any other way other than over the top.
Right, so that's just a fact that there's some time being taken, as we all found out at IBC, on when the next version of the standard is going to be hammered out.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the thing about broadcast is the fact that everybody has to agree on what the standard is. But if I'm running a closed service, I simply have to get my app onto devices that are going to be receiving the service.
Right. Okay. About the broadcast situation, Ian, IBC didn't show a lot of clarity about that. Can you clarify what you think the current situation is about the next UHD standard?
Well, I think broadcasters largely come in two flavors, if you like. Those who feel compelled to actually join the 4K or UHD bandwagon early for brand recognition purposes, and those who really want to see some clarity in terms of the standards. We've already seen broadcasters who've gone very early with a service and feel that they can launch a service based purely on resolution alone. And then there are some broadcasters who are actually waiting to see perhaps the higher frame rate being addressed, perhaps seeing high dynamic range and so forth actually appear in a standard. Because I think it is difficult for broadcasters to actually launch a service, given that there are a lot of early adopters out there with screens of varying capability. So I think to anyone looking at it from outside, it is a confusing scenario for broadcasters at the moment, waiting for clarity for the specifications to come. And I think also the other point that we need to make about a lot of the OTT platforms adopting 4K is that a lot of the material lends itself well to just 4K resolution, as in cinematic material, is currently restricted to below 24 frames per second, whereas what broadcasters would really like to use is full 50, 60 frames per second for sports type material. So I think that the situation that you've got now is you've either got broadcasters who want to achieve early brand recognition and launching services now, or the broadcasters who are waiting until they can see some clarity in terms of the specification and feel that they're addressing a wide enough audience who've got a stable feature set in the sets that they're using.
So for the short term, I mean, apart from the very small minority of broadcasters who are actually doing a 4K type of service, that does leave streamed 4K services. So, I mean, what is the market opportunity here, and for which type of services for interested players, OTT or otherwise, to get involved? Are the traditional media companies at a disadvantage here or not? Spencer, what's your view?
So let me just back up a second. Over the top doesn't necessarily mean streamed. If you look at Sony's 4K Video Unlimited service, which we launched, I think, 2 years ago now, that is a download service, and it can be VOD, but you do have to wait for it to download. But that's the way to get the highest possible quality 4K to a consumer at the moment. If you're streaming it, you are limited by the immediately available bandwidth. That having been said, I think traditional media companies are faced with this on all of their services, and the problem is that to the extent that they tie their relationship with the consumer to using a particular piece of spectrum, whether it's over the air, on a satellite, or on a cable system, then it's going to be very difficult for them to create these 4K services until the standards are sorted out. But if they look upon their relationship with the consumer as being a relationship between them and as an entity and their brand and so on, and the consumer, and they look to other transports, over the top being the obvious one at the moment, then I think they can proceed in that marketplace, and they don't need to necessarily wait. And of course, they've got a rich selection of content with which to offer their audience.
I mean, is that content amenable to creating more immersive pixels, if you like, including HDR in particular?
So I think Ian really hit the nail on the head there with what sort of content have we got? Clearly, if they're going to do a live events, then a 50, 60 frames a second like sporting events, and that is certainly much more of a challenge. But that's equally a challenge for anybody that's trying to do that over the top. But if you look at the pre-recorded stuff, episodic television and movies and so on, then I think that is amenable to it. The shot 24, 25 frames a second is typically these days shot on digital cinema style cameras, 35 millimeter sized CMOS images, and those are amenable to creating both HDR and 4K, and in that case you've got a very great selection of raw material there with which to offer the public. And I think the assets that come out of the production there are very amenable to both of those, both HDR and 4K.
Right. Ian, if streaming, or I take Spencer's point about the download option as well, but to come back to streaming, does streaming, because it's already, Netflix already doing it, for example, does that open the way for a multi-screen strategy from traditional players that could allow them to compete in this 4K market, such as it is at the moment, in preparation for the arrival of proper broadcast UHD with all the bells and whistles as a sort of killer immersive app, if you like?
I think very much so. I think that the idea that broadcasters are restricted to linear scheduled, and providers like Netflix to OTT is a little bit too simplistic in this marketplace, because most of the big brand broadcasters are involved in all aspects of it, not only live broadcast but also streaming, and undoubtedly. As I'm sure we're going to discuss later on in this webinar, the aspect of scaling viewing for UHD is an issue. Bandwidth, either from satellite cable or terrestrial, or even over broadband, is very much an issue. And I think that whilst the numbers are low, early entrance into a market, particularly say a premium sports market, using the streaming option, either from an OTT or from a traditional broadcaster, is a vehicle that both will use, because I actually see UHD and 4K services more aligning themselves with multi-screen delivery, at least in the early stages, than I ever see them adopting the same strategy that was used when HD was launched as a replacement for SD, where there was sort of a like-for-like replacement of spectrum. So I think, as you're seeing now with a lot of the premium services here in Europe, ostensibly being broadband-based, multicast to the home for HD-type services, I think UHD will repeat that formula.
Just to take you up on one point, I mean, there was an idea circulating at IBC that actually you could send stuff, with, like an HD signal with HDR or whatever, and you could upconvert it for a 4K set at the other end, and that would actually offer a rather better quality, immersive quality than HD on its own. Does this idea of kind of sending an enhanced HD signal, if you like, to across networks where there isn't enough bandwidth for full UHD, does that make sense to upconvert it at the consumer end?
Very much so. I mean, if you actually pull up the bitrate slide that we pre-prepared, it actually compares and contrasts the particular scenarios that you're talking about.
Let me push that. I think that's up now. Yeah.
I mean, looking at this slide, if we just explain it a little bit, because I think it's important to understand, if you actually connected an HD signal straight to a UHD set, chances are you'd get a pretty poor quality result, and a result that consumers wouldn't feel happy about from trading their HD set for UHD. If you actually then tried True HD, which is more analogous to Blu-ray or 1080p, used a little bit more bit rate, you would get an enhanced quality. And it's this particular scenario that a lot of people are focusing on, that typically the access bit rates that are available either through broadband, satellite, cable or terrestrial are not yet at the level where you would actually be able to do mass delivery of that media using UHD, simply because it would take too much bandwidth. And if you did try and actually use native UHD, the result would look poorer than using HD and then upscaling it at your UHD screen. And it surprises a number of people that this is actually the situation. But currently speaking, if you actually look at the availability for unicast connections and unicast connections that are adequate enough for streamed video, it supports this case that actually broadcasting using HD and then up converting at the screen achieves a much better picture than restricting the UHD and compressing it so much. That was definitely a theme where quite a number of proponents of HDR schemes were illustrating this by up converting 1080p material with their particular flavour of HDR technique.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to the master slide, and time for a. There is was time scheduled for a Q&A, but we've only got one question so far. So what I'm going to do is go on to the next section, and we might have a few more questions in a bigger break at the end of that. So section 2 is about enabling premium 4K multi-screen services. So the first question, Ian, I'll direct to you again. What are the technologies needed for high-quality 4K stroke UHD multi-screen services, talking about, encoding to play out and delivery from the cloud or the head end down to the consumer? What are the technologies needed to make that happen?
Well, I think taking it back from the camera, you almost immediately get into this issue about coax or SDI techniques versus IP. It really, the industry's in limbo where it's either using multiple SDI connections to actually connect from the camera to a server. And I think the thing that will really set the industry alight is when it universally adopts one of the higher end Ethernet standards for actually ingest of data. You've then got the sort of the play out from servers, again in an IP environment, and much of the emphasis at IBC was tailored towards total IP production workflows. And I think anyone contemplating doing a revamp of particularly a sports-based studio would look to see it being future-proofed, network media, big data, and looking to see all of that encompassing sort of what would be the next wave of IP production workflows. I think that the other thing that we would expect to see for cloud and head end all the way to the consumer is more widespread usage of UHD players and branded players, where broadcasters could get branded recognition from a particular player that they will be using. And I think this harks back to the point that we made earlier on, that UHD, particularly for sports type applications, isn't necessarily going to go the way that HD did with linear scheduled, and I think is going to become increasingly more reliant upon downloadable players and media players in the home, that those are a vital element to sort of make sure that you can get a seamless UHD route through to the consumer when bandwidth's available, when multicast technologies have been implemented. And we're beginning to see those starting to emerge, albeit for adoption within the privileged few who are in metropolitan areas that have got good enough coverage. But I think it really is a combination of bandwidth availability, further push of adoption of IP, particularly for production and encoding, and then genuine mass availability of players, either on media PCs or smart TVs, because we're still in an evolutionary stage for display devices to be able to cope with decoding for HEVC.
Okay, that's a very full answer. Thanks for that, Ian. Spencer, I was wondering if we're talking about multi-screen 4K UHD delivery, could HDR plus an enhanced audio have a role to play in that, even though that's a constrained environment?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does, and I think we've demonstrated that with Amazon, which has just launched HDR streaming. The fundamental thing here is on the display end, is that we're no longer constrained by the characteristics of CRT displays. And if you look at Rec 709, then the dynamic range and the color gamut are really set by what you could do on a CRT. New TVs have had wider color gamuts for some time. The Sony TVs have supported XBYCC, which is about as far as you can get within the using the same signaling as Rec 709. And then you've also got enhanced audio coming out, and the most exciting thing about that, I think, is the way of deploying enhanced audio on a smaller number of speakers than you might think is necessary. And I think we're starting to see some of those things coming out on the market. So I think both of those are enabled by a shift away from the older legacy standards and to new standards that are based around what's capable today, and more importantly, future. Well, I wouldn't say future proofing, because that's always a dangerous thing to say. But certainly they've got room for looking at future displays, future audio technologies. So yeah, I think we can just generally improve the consumer experience all around.
And what about network capacity, Spencer? I mean, there's obviously going to be a critical issue. I mean, even if we upconvert in the short term at the consumer end, maybe, but how's that going to improve going forward, or can it improve going forward?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. Excuse me. Sorry, when I've got a cold is probably the wrong moment to sign up for a webinar. I mean, I think there's several obvious factors here. I think first of all, Ian's company is certainly leading the way in making more efficient codecs, and that becomes really important in conserving the bandwidth you have. You've also got adaptive streaming and smarter adaptive streaming that allows at least the stream to continue during the points where congestion may slow you down. But I think clearly the biggest factor here is the fact that bandwidth to consumer is improving, at least in urban areas. But my provider here, Time Warner Cable, just increased my available bandwidth to 300 megabits per second. I can stream Blu-ray over that. But I think more importantly, it's not just in the metropolitan areas. Up in Keswick in the north of England, in Cumbria, BT has told me I can have 80 megabits per second. I haven't yet tested it, but I mean that gives you some idea of where in the UK, for example, the rollout of fibre is significantly increasing bandwidth available to consumers. So there's really all three factors at play there, and all of them will seek to combine together to improve the resolution that consumers are seeing.
Okay, thanks for that. Time to present the poll, and let me just push the questions to the screen again. So you can see it there. And I'm going to do a Q&A in the next few minutes, but if you, the audience, would like to participate and submit your answers to the question and click on the relevant radio button and submit, then we can collate them all at the end of the Q&A in about 3 or 4 minutes' time. So I'll leave that up for the moment. Let's have a look at the questions that are coming in. Yes, so there's one from Giuseppe Krisky. What kind of average quality of experience can we expect with only, in inverted commas, 15 megabits per second bandwidth for Ultra HD services in terms of PFNR and SSIM. SSIM, two terms I'm afraid I'm not familiar with. Do either of you want to field that one?
Well, I'll tell you what, if you put my favourite slide, which is the bitrate slide up again, which is slide number 3,
okay.
I'll take that. Are you happy for me to do that, Spencer?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I think you're better equipped to answer this question.
Well, I think that where we finished was talking about allocating slightly more bitrate to actually get more fidelity to an up-converted HD to UHD, True HD input to Ultra HD output. If you then look at 4K movie streaming, you'll see that in this, I say that it's state of the art could get it down to 10 megabits per second. And you'll see that the other columns here really deal with what are we talking about here? Are we talking about with HDR? Are we talking about low frame rate, etc.? And I think that for 4K movie assets, as we're seeing now with a lot of the streaming services, they are operating somewhere between 10 to 16 megabits raw video rate, where it tends to be that the access rate to the home has got to be at about 22 to 25 megabits to get a good, robust service that's adequate for 4K movie streaming. I think that to replicate what we're seeing now for true HD services, so 1080p 5060, albeit there aren't that many of those that are genuinely broadcast live at 5060 progressive, but if you were trying to replicate that in a UHD environment, you'd be probably talking about 15 megabits plus. And then probably the ultimate, and the one that we haven't really talked about, and that a lot of sports coverage would aspire to, would be the very high frame rates, the 100, 120 frame rate, that would really make UHD, sort of an immersive surface and zing against its HD comparison. You'd be looking at somewhere, in excess of 20, 25 megabits. So I think at the moment, round about 15 megabits is just about adequate for run-of-the-mill episodic type content. It would do 4K movies very well, and is one of the reasons why your first question concentrated on, sort of the 4K streaming of movies. And I think in the fullness of time, as Spectrum reallocates, reshuffles the deck in terms of SD, HD multi-screen provision, and also multicast comes on board, also shuffling how people will actually be able to use their broadband connectivity, plus of course mobile spectrum clearance. Those are all going to be things that are going to enable better connection to the home from service providers, and that's just looking at it from the traditional spectrum of what broadcast currently uses now. That's not even referring to 5G or LTE or so forth. And what this is all saying is that a lot of providers are tackling it from very different angles, but all with the intention of offering more reliable, more scaling to delivering video-based services.
Okay. Here's another question from Andrea DiPolo, which I think you could field, Spencer. What is the major issue that prevents today Ultra HD 4K being widely available? Costs or lack of HQ content?
Well, in our case, it's certainly not lack of content. We've got over 200 titles out there if you count a TV episode as one title, and we're shooting all of our episodic television in 4K. So certainly not a lack of content. I think that what's happening here is that we're only just seeing the emergence of much wider services being available. I mean, Sony has had its service up for as I said, 2 years, but it was only last year that Netflix came on and Amazon came online with 4K streaming, and I think that's what's going to precipitate the further deployment of UHD 4K. availability to the consumer. But there is one more factor in there as well, and that is the cost of the 4K TV sets. And I think we can see that the costs are heading downwards at some point in the future, I am sure, and this is just a supposition on my part, that larger screens will all be 4K because there will eventually be no cost difference between producing a 1080 and a 4K TV. And in the same way that right now all large screen TVs are 1080 and that 720 has pretty much disappeared. So I think those are really the two factors there.
Okay. I wanted to push the poll result up at this point, but my screen's not cooperating with me. So let me just...
I can buy you some time if you want whilst you sort that out, because I think the last comment that Spencer made about the availability of screens.
Got it.
A lot of people
keep on going.
A lot of people have talked about this issue about HDR being offered on HD screens. The fact of the matter is that consumers have already got the message about 4K and UHD and are purchasing screens on the expectation that services will come and backfill, what is currently offered as HD as UHD or 4K type services. And so, the customers have got it now. And I think Spencer's comment about the fact that nobody would really buy an SD screen now with HD, sort of firmly established in the marketplace. We've got to look into the future where screen manufacturers are setting their expectations to ship UHD or 4K capable screens only.
Okay, thanks for filling in there. Yes, I've got it now. I'm going to push it to the audience. Let's see if anything happens. And it's not cooperating. Okay, let's go on to. We'll try and get that up. If I could listen to some of our technicians if I could speak to some of the technicians listening in the background, could you try and get the poll result up for us by the end? But anyway, we'll plunge into section 3, which is about HDR and advanced audio ecosystems. So. Spencer, one of the buzzwords at IBC was HDR. There were various flavors of it being discussed, including, I think, something called HDR+. Can you clarify what we're talking about here, where we're at with it, and its importance for a next-generation viewing experience?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that HDR Plus is a pretty loosely defined term, so I'd rather steer away from that one. But going more specifically, there's really two factors here. One is the 10-bit color depth, and I think it's very difficult to do HDR with 8-bit. The possibility of banding, is probably so high that you actually don't want to do it, or if you do want to do it, you're dithering like crazy, which is not necessarily improving the quality of the picture by injecting noise into it. So I think that the 10-bit is a foregone conclusion, and certainly I have seen some material that suggests that 10-bit is actually easier to encode than 8-bit, which is kind of counterintuitive, but very interesting. And I think the other thing is that the wide color gamut kind of comes with that, because again, we're talking about TVs that are not bound by the constraints of CRT displays, and they can push out beyond Rec 709. They can map a BT 2020 down to the space they have available, and so I think that to some extent the wide color gamut comes with the fact that you're no longer dealing with a legacy there. But of the two, certainly the 10-bit color depth is the most important, and HDR is not just a question of more detail in the specular or more detail in the dark the blacks in your picture, but it's also the fact that the colors stay richer as they get brighter, so you don't sort of have this tendency to everything to clip to white as the brightness of a particular color goes up.
Okay. Ian, we've talked a lot about the bit rates, so I don't want to batter those to death, but what about things like, impact on the delivery chain, like receivers themselves? There are EU TV set power consumption rules, and I quite likely, I imagine, but you'll tell me that they have these rules in other areas of the world as well. What kind of impact might there be there in those terms, power consumption?
Well, I think that's an excellent issue, because if you actually go to any of the shows, be it NAB or CES, you can certainly get the full-on retina burning HDR demonstrations showing sets going all the way up to anywhere between 4 and 10,000 nits. But undoubtedly, as with any of the white goods that you buy at the moment, there are heavy restrictions in terms of what the regulators will allow. Going to CES last January showed that most of the sets are a considerable improvement on what you've got at the home. At the moment, you can get roughly about 100 nit type performance, and some of the sets were purporting to go anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 nits, which certainly is a vast improvement on what you've got at the moment. I think that, color grading monitors that are used in a professional type environment are going up to something like 4,000 nits, leaving there a lot of headroom to go all the way up to the real power hungry monsters that can really make pictures sing. I think the biggest issue, though, is that screens have been introduced with the features being drip-fed onto consumers. So screen legacy is already a massive issue for anyone contemplating doing a UHD service. Now, to date, most of the screens that have been shipped have been referenced to HD color space, Rec 709. And I think that, as say with the BBC Live Hybrid Log Gamma approach, where it actually tries to launch something that achieves display independence and offers a forward path like that, that is equally as much an issue as the power consumption and the brightness capability of any screens and high dynamic range of any particular screen.
Right, okay. Talking over to you, Spencer, talking about HDR. Some people think HFR, high frame rate, is the thing to go for. Other people say HDR, which Ian's just been talking about, and even others say, well, we can't leave advanced audio out of the equation if we're talking about immersive technology. Can you weigh these various options for us and tell us which of these is more important, or do they all have to come together?
So I think let's deal with high frame rate first.
Yeah.
It's an interesting definition of terms. I was talking some time ago, to Chris Johns, the chief engineer at Sky, about high frame rate. And in fact, I was talking at the time about The Hobbit coming out at 48 frames a second, and he quite rightly pointed out to me that they call that low frame rate. So we certainly do have a definition of terms there. I anticipate that we will see more movies coming out at frame rates greater than 48, probably 60, maybe even 120, to the extent that you can display those. So I think we will see a shift in movie content, at least among some filmmakers, away from 24. Now, clearly, the choice of 24 versus 60 is as much these days as much of an artistic choice as a technical choice. So I would not expect 24 to vanish by any means, and still that will be the majority of the content. But in the case of broadcaster, high frame rate clearly means more than 50 or 60, so it means 100 or 120, and that really is a question for a broadcaster to talk about there, although my instinct is that certainly 100 or 120 is probably a much better way of displaying sports, and not just because of the action on the field, but also because of a fast pan across with the crowd in the background. And I think that is to a great extent is technically orthogonal to high dynamic range, but clearly again the TVs are going to get the increasing level of capability here, and if somebody creates a 4K TV is capable of taking 120 frames per second signal, I wouldn't anticipate they would not put HDR in it. So I think these are all cumulative in terms of what the consumer is going to be buying. And at the same time, I think that we will see that HDR makes a very great impact on the quality of the picture and the consumer experience. So I wouldn't expect somebody to go up to a high frame rate, depending on, regardless of whose definition you use, without also including HDR into that.
Okay. Okay, we've got time for a question or two.
Sorry, can I just add
yeah,
something?
You didn't talk about enhanced audio, did you?
Well, and actually, I also didn't talk about HD. I think what Ian said a few minutes ago is absolutely correct. I mean, you can certainly do HDR on an HD signal, but again, the consumer is going to be displaying that on a 4K panel. So whether therefore at that point you can actually separate out the means of acquisition from the means of display. There are cameras, digital cinema cameras that aren't 4K but certainly have a good dynamic range, and so there is a pool of content that was shot on those cameras which is available. The immersive audio, though, I think is really also very important, because it turns out that we're much more susceptible or much more aware of the quality of audio. And if the audio quality can be improved, we may be forgiving about the quality of the picture. And the ways of delivering audio now such that it does create this great immersive experience. So you hear a sound behind you and you actually look around to see where it was. I think that is also a really important part of this.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry I was premature in going to questions. I have one from Tristan Veal. What is the likelihood of the industry adopting a standard for HDR created by a player that isn't a CE manufacturer, such as the Dolby HDR standard? So isn't created by a CE manufacturer. Is that anything anyone wants to take a bet on?
Well, I actually think that a lot of the emphasis at IBC was about display independence. And certainly some of the HDR schemes from a codec point of view, it's whether we actually can pass the signal plus the metadata. And I think that for the industry to genuinely progress to display independence and format independence, it's both a signal and metadata type issue. Now, I'll make no secret of the fact that there are any number of color proposals on the table, any number of high dynamic range proposals on the table, that they in themselves, how they actually interoperate and how you actually transfer from one scheme to another, heavily relies upon metadata and heavily relies upon standardization to allow interoperability. I would actually see that a number of schemes will exist where certain schemes are good for HDR broadcasts, so broadcast live like sports events, say the BBC's hybrid log gamma, where you might well see that for something that was ostensibly VOD or cinematic based, could adopt the Dolby scheme. There are other schemes like sort of Technicolor and so forth. And I think that what we are seeing in the marketplace now is this issue about metadata facilitating the format conversion, as we've done in all broadcast workflows, from one format to another format, getting closer to what's actually presented to the user. So I can see those schemes being adopted, but I don't think any one scheme will dominate, at least in the short term. I think it will be multi-offering on the HDR front for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
Yeah,
go on, Spencer. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't really jump in here, but I'm actually right the second having a little bit of a struggle thinking about a HDR standard which is coming out of the CE industry. I mean, if you look at what's out there, we've got PQ, which is a SMPTE standard. We've got Dolby Vision, which is a way of delivering a PQ in a way that's also backward compatible with SDR, a dual layer solution. That's proprietary. You've got the Philips and the Technicolor methods, which are also largely proprietary. And as Ian said, it's the metadata that counts. And then you have hybrid log gamma, which is a product of R&D work done by broadcasters, by the BBC and NHK. So right this second, I'm actually thinking that they're actually coming from all different places, and that the CE manufacturers are really are working hard to implement them on their displays.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm told the audience could see the poll results, so I'm going to ask my colleagues at Videonet to push up the results one more time, and just so we can have a final look at them. And there they are. And it looks like there's it's even Stevens. But yes, I mean, well, put it this way, 90% think yes, but half of them say yes and quickly, and the other half say yes but no hurry, and a small minority think of broadcast services are what matter. So I'm glad we've got that clear. I'm sorry for the technical snafu there, guys. I couldn't see it at all. Okay, so into the final section now, the roadmap to truly immersive video. This is the final section, as I say. So maybe we could first sum up, Ian, I'll direct this to you, what the UHD standards roadmap looks like, and what the attitudes of broadcasters and platform operators are to the inclusion of all the technologies we've been discussing and their timing. Can you kind of briefly sum up what you think the steps, the milestones will be on that roadmap to all singing, all dancing UHD?
Well, I think for streaming movie services, it's here and it's with us now. And since it's more of a closed environment, you are seeing the adoption of HDR techniques being implemented in that closed delivery environment, particularly with downloadable software players facilitating that closed environment and the inclusion of HDR. What gets more challenging is when you're actually talking about linear delivery, not only from comparison to existing HD services, but also from the viewpoint of what flavor of UHD is broadcast. And I think this is the most tricky area that challenges broadcasters, and some are going now. They believe that brand recognition is needed, and they're using premium sports as their vehicle to press ahead with services that are consistent with the feature set offered from screens. Other broadcasters are waiting for phase 2 type functionality to come on in 18 months, 2 years, where there is genuine support for HDR, perhaps some of the different color schemes that have been specifically written for UHD, like 2020, and I'd imagine that happened, in the next 18 months to sort of 3 years type time frame. It is on a slower time frame for linear rather than OTT or streaming type services. But again, it comes back to people needing to feel comfortable that there are standards to facilitate interoperability, and that we are not going to be foisting on the viewing public sets and services that are incompatible, and that's the particularly tricky area for the broadcast environment.
Okay, thanks for that, Ian. And similarly, Spencer, could you summarise where we are with your thinking about the economics of broadcast UHD and the likely service evolution, including VOD and linear delivery?
Well, I think it's actually interesting to see what's happened with our licensees. When we started, licensing content to 4K services, as we anticipated at the time, it would start off with download services and then migrate to streaming and then to broadcast. But in fact, what we've seen is that broadcasters in Korea and in Japan have been able to bring up 4K services in various flavors very, very quickly. And I think we have, off the top of my head, probably about half a dozen licensees of our content in those two countries that are doing it using traditional broadcast services. So I think that it certainly does come down to what your broadcast standards are to start with, and then how quickly those standards can evolve. And as Ian pointed out, it's a question of how closed is your system. DirecTV has launched a 4K service in the US, and they're doing it over their existing satellite as a push VOD. And they've been actually remarkably clever about how they've done that. And so that demonstrates, I think, that there are ways for broadcasters to start launching 4K services even without a massive upgrade. I think, though, really the economics of broadcasting going to UHD really is very much an open question at the moment, because it just depends so much on the standards that are necessary and what other part of the infrastructure do you have to upgrade. For example, if you can do live sports broadcasting, then you've got some inventiveness needed to go on there to take an OB truck from HD to 4K.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I think we'll jump to the last question in this section and do a bit of future gazing at this point. So looking forward, what is the wider market opportunity for immersive video? And I'm thinking of, perhaps some of the more far out things like, 360-degree TV, maybe using companion screens to help navigate the main UHD screen, maybe even VR broadcasting. Spencer, do you want to do a bit of future gazing about what, if any, of these things, or what you think are the future things that might happen which aren't yet there or possible technically today?
Give me 1 second. Sorry, I picked the wrong moment there to cough. Yeah, well, there is so much on offer and being tried out. It is extraordinarily difficult at the moment to think about which might be successful and take off. So let me first of all talk about the factors that are involved in this, and then perhaps leave the audience to draw their own conclusions. The first thing is that if you look at 360 video, you've got multiple ways of displaying it. You could put it on a TV screen and do swiping on a tablet or a phone to control it. You can take the approach of Google Cardboard, which is a 3D experience on your phone, and a very simple piece of kit to hold that phone up to your eyes. It's a folded piece of cardboard with two lenses in it, and you get possibly a reasonable 3D VR experience using it. And at that point, you've got a very low cost of entry for consumers to start looking at VR, and there's also there's content available there. Of course, in that case, one might think about, well, what's the duration of the content? How long can you actually sit there with your arms up? Then you've got the very high quality displays that are coming on, the head-mounted displays like Sony's PlayStation VR, which are an incredible visual experience, and you can totally immersive there. And I've seen some content on that, which is so immersive it's actually positively scary, because you would think lose track of the fact you are actually not looking at something that's real. Those offer a great range of ways of viewing the content, and then on top of that you've got actually the nature of the content itself. If it is it a narrative? If it's a narrative, then how do you tell stories in that space? And I think that is very much a challenge, and not one that we've come even close to exploring the boundaries of storytelling in that space. And then also there's the fact, even just the simple fact is, do you do 360 or is 120 or 180 or 210 enough? I mean, if we look at a stadium, for example, and I'm sitting on the halfway line in a football stadium, do I particularly want to see the crowds behind me? It's novelty the first time I do it, but I'm not actually going to sit there and watch the crowd. I'm going to sit there and watch the match. And from a halfway point, one could argue that even less than 180 degrees gives you everything you need to see there. So I think the angle of view that you need is going to be highly dependent on the material. And the smaller the angle of view that's necessary, the easier it is to do it. It's when you try to do 360 and deal with that stitching problem, then that becomes a significant challenge. And then you've also got Google Spotlight, which is well worth a look too. And this is not one that you actually hold up, but rather you move your phone around or your tablet around as sort of a window into a virtual world. And you can either do that by moving it around or by swiping it. And what they've also implemented in Spotlight is the very interesting thing of a branching story. But unlike previous attempts at doing sort of pick your own ending, this one the viewer is making choices without realizing they're making choices. So they're not pushing a button, but the story might progress depending on what they have to be staring at a particular point in time. And that again, that really opens up some very interesting aspects of narrative storytelling. Which we haven't explored, which is totally new. So I think the thing is that this is extremely wide open, and wouldn't even dream of suggesting where it's going, because I don't think we know. I don't think we've even begun to test the limits of it.
Spencer, that's a masterful panoramic view of what the future holds. Thanks very much for that. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for at the moment. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for tuning in and asking questions and answering them through the poll, which I'm pleased we did see the results of in the end. And special thanks also to our two speakers, Spencer Stevens from Sony Pictures and Ian Trow from Harmonic, for helping us to untangle a very complex subject. This has been the Videonet webcast. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.